What are your night shift horror stories? Story 1. Worked at a liquor store for a few years. One of the homeless guys, probably late 50s, that stood outside would ask for money, and 9 times out of 10, if they said no, he flashed them his old wrinkly crusty package. Had to chase him off every night so people didn't have to suffer that sight. Annoyingly, people who saw me chasing him off or threatening to call the cops often gave me dirty looks, as if I hated homeless people or treated them like trash, when in actuality I was saving them from that which you cannot unsee. Story 2. This didn't become a horror story until recently, but as a teen, I used to close down the gas station/truck stop I worked at alone. My boss used to pop up out of the shadows as I was closing down the till with the backup lights on. He'd be super calm and act like it wasn't creepy at 11 p.m. when he should be home with his family. He was even at my high school graduation. He had his wife's numbers still in my phone. Anyhow, he is currently on trial for finishing a lover via knife until she passed away back in '94. Cold case potentially solved via DNA and modern science. Story 3. I hate recalling this story. I work at a rehab facility. We have a protected gate with a camera looking down from above and one of those doorbell cameras. In the office, the camera monitor is on one wall and the doorbell monitor is on another. I was doing some paperwork and see this guy walk past, stop for a few seconds, then slowly turned around, walked back and stared at the camera. And he kept staring. The facility is in a rough neighborhood, so I'm fairly used to folks hanging out around the gate and usually ignore it. But the way he was staring was off-putting. Like his eyes and expression were hollow and dead, almost as if he were in deep thought about something horrible. I was pretty sure he was zonked on synthetics. I used the intercom to see if he was okay, but he just kept staring directly at the camera. We have a rule: if it's not hurt or trying to come through the fence, just let it be. No sense in engaging needlessly with somebody potentially hostile or messing with the locals. Y'all, he stood there and stared at that camera for 2 hours. That same dead-eyed expression staring right at me. I did a round and came back to find him gone, which only creeped me out more. Story 4. I believe in ghosts, but personally I don't think this was paranormal, but definitely scary. I worked part-time cleaning dishes in a Mexican restaurant. It was about 9 p.m. and I had to throw the trash. Unlike what you'd think, we had the trash bins inside the building. I'm not sure how the building worked since I only knew the restaurant and not the buildings around. Anyway, to throw the trash away, we had to carry the wheel bin down a downward hallway, which led to a pair of big metal push doors on the left. I was going down there with a headphone on, but by the time I got to the hallway, the connection stopped and it was dead silent. I got to the doors and threw the trash away. As I grabbed the bin and went to push the heavy doors again, I heard a loud punch-like sound behind me. To explain better, when you walk into the trash bin room, there's 2 bins, one on your left and the other in front of you. Next to the bin on the left, there's another pair of doors. These doors had glass circles, so you could see the other side but very little. When I turned around, I saw those doors. The ones which I needed to use strength to open were swinging as if kicked or pushed with some force. I quickly got out of there and tried to forget about it each time I had to throw the trash there again. I quit the job after a few months. Story 5. Used to work the night shift at a 24-hour Walmart. Customers are mess enough in the daytime, but they become weird after midnight. Once had an elderly guy came in wearing only a jean jacket and fishnet stockings. He came up to my register, leaned in, and asked if we carried anything to get rid of lice. Those plastic barriers all stores have now to protect cashiers. They need to keep those even after the pandemic ends. I lost count of the times customers got into my personal space to ask about products for fleas, lice, rashes, etc. Story 6. Was an orderly at a hospital. 2 of us were sitting in the basement office adjacent to the morgue. A guy passed our office, looking at us a little shifty, came back again and asked if we had access to the morgue. We said yes, thinking he was doing a pickup for a funeral home. But that seemed strange given it was around 12:30 a.m. No. He wanted to pay us to let him in and leave him alone with the bodies for an hour. We escorted him up to security. Apparently he had tried it in the past, as security knew him. Story 7. It was 3 a.m. Popular Canadian coffee shop. There is one old baker in the back that rarely interacts with me past a joke or a dirtier ditty from his Navy days. Other than that, I'm alone. Not another soul around the area, and I expect it to remain so for at least an hour yet. I'm boxing up the day-olds for the homeless shelter when I swear I see something out of the corner of my eye. It's behind me. I turn, then look down. There's a small child standing there, a native little toddler with a foxhawk staring at me intensely. I'm struck dumb with how absurd the situation is. How did he get behind the counter? I didn't hear the door open or see him come through the counter. I scan the storefront. No one. I yell for the baker in case he has a friend or something visiting that lost their kid. He comes over and, like me, does a double take at the kid and is baffled. Kid starts muttering incoherently. I get him a glass of water and a donut hole, and the baker runs out of the store to do a perimeter of the block. I call the non-emergency line and explain I have a little kid with no parents. I can't get any information from the boy. Just mumbles I can't make out. Police arrive. Baker comes back and says that he can't find anyone else in the streets. The guy from the 24/7 corner store said he'll keep an eye out. Police try to speak to the kid and also get nothing but mutterings and half-hearted gestures. They take him away. I saw them again for their morning coffee, and they told me the little guy walked several kilometers from the nearest reservation in the dead of night to my store. He had got into his parents' medicine cabinet and just walked out of the house. I'm floored. It must have taken that poor baby hours to get to me. Seeing him behind me like that in the dead of the night still shakes me. Spooked me more than the guy that threw a pot of coffee at me, the woman that tried to stab me with a plastic spoon because I refused to give her a metal one, and the dude that waited around for 4 hours hoping to catch me alone, so he could teach me a lesson since I didn't have the flavor of bagel he wanted. Story 8. Warning, medical gross stuff incoming. I worked in an emergency room. The worst night that comes to mind involves a patient that was bitten by a baby timber rattlesnake. He was bleeding out of every single orifice by the time he got to us. More blood than I'd ever seen before outside of a motorcycle versus 75 miles per hour headfirst to asphalt. I don't remember how many doses of Crofab we gave him, but it was the hospital's entire supply. But trying to get him stabilized, arranging the helicopter transport to a bigger and better equipped facility. All the blood, those weren't the worst parts. The worst part was when the patient lost control of his bowels. I will ever forget that smell. I spent the entire time standing by the door with a battery-powered fan and a handful of gauze pads saturated with cinnamon oil trying to reduce some of the smell. The doctor occasionally stuck her head out just so I could waft the cinnamon oil in her face. Yes, by some miracle the patient did end up surviving, and as far as I know he made a full recovery. But the blood, the smell, and just the shock of it all. Yeah, never underestimate a baby timber rattlesnake. Story 9. I worked in an open quarry mine down in Texas. We had this storm where it rained for hours and hours. Being night shift, 6:30 p.m. 6:30 a.m. Supervisor, I was in charge of 8 Cat 745 haul trucks, 2 Cat 390 excavators, 6 Cat 980 loaders, 2 D8 dozers, and 1 D9 dozer. It was about 2 a.m. when I had 3 haul trucks get stuck in the bottom of the mine, just spinning their tires endlessly. It was horrible. Since we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars of production per shift, I had to get permission to shut the mine down from the superintendent and relay that to the supervisors up in the plant that washes/dries the material, frac sand. They wouldn't shut down because I said so. I called him at least 13 times within an hour to get him to shut the mine down. Since it was 2 a.m., he never answered, which never happened, as he always had his phone on. 3 to 4 of us were soaking wet and covered from head to toe in mud, to the point where you couldn't even tell we were wearing neon green high-vis safety gear. We got the trucks pulled out of the mine after roughly 3 hours of using a combo of the dozers and loaders and excavators to essentially build a new road from drier materials. The superintendent got in at 6 a.m. for the 6:30 a.m. 6:30 p.m. shift, took one look at the mine, and shut it down for the day. Turns out his phone charger came unplugged and his phone died in the middle of the night. Never knew I called. Story 10. Many years ago, I worked at a regional radio station in the middle of nowhere, Australia. I was the overnight operator. Keep the overnight playlist running, set up for the morning, do all the manual checks for the next day, and jump on the desk if anything funky happens. I spent a lot of time sitting in what was essentially a tin shed in the middle of a paddock, with my dog, shoes off, listening to 50s and 60s music and doing crossword puzzles. Except one night when the roost shooters came through. They spooked the kangaroos in the paddock, and one of them jumped headfirst through our office window. So there's me, barefoot and half asleep, when this 6-tall kangaroo smashes through the glass window. Blood and glass everywhere. My dog starts chasing the kangaroo, I'm chasing my dog. And the kangaroo bounds around the office, knocking off desks in the dark, bleeding everywhere. I ran and opened the studio bay doors, and my dog chased it outside, where I'm assuming the poor thing, the kangaroo, was fired. Then I had to call my boss. Story 11. I was once staying late doing some scenic painting at a college campus theater. It was late, pitch black dark outside and very quiet in the building. A few of us were up on the stage, not really talking, just taking care of business when suddenly I saw out of the corner of my eye something go very quickly by the open door to the lobby. I was like, what the? Then it went by again, and I actually saw what it was. A guy with long hair, wearing pajamas, and no socks or shoes. He was tiptoeing in a very exaggerated way, pulling his knees up very high and grinning. It sounds kind of funny, but it was creepy as hell. We all made eye contact, and one of the other painters was just about to go shut the door when the dude walked right in. He stood there staring at us for a full minute. You could have heard a pin drop. He threw his arms out to the sides dramatically and said, "I am your savior, Jesus Christ." No one responded, and he eventually walked out. I guess he was hoping to get more of a reaction. The door was promptly shut and locked behind him, and security called. They were not impressed. Turns out that he was a patient at some sort of group home nearby and had done this multiple times. I still get creeped out to this day if I'm working in a theater at night though. Story 12. Worked night shift at a large grocery store, one that wasn't open overnight but had a skeleton crew to work the loads and do prep and clean. I worked near the entrance. Large glass doors but visually blocked off from my vantage point. Around 3 a.m., I hear knocking on the doors. This isn't completely uncalled for. Usually it's someone coming in for an early shift, but didn't have a key card. Sometimes it's someone's food delivery, or sometimes a customer who thinks we are open despite clearly being closed. I approach the door. It's a man that I don't recognize, wet from the rain. He looks normal enough, but something about him unnerved me. He had that vibe to him, you know the one, where it seems like maybe they're on their way to becoming a full-blown addict, but for now they still manage to give the appearance of functionality. He was holding together just enough to appear normal, but the edges were definitely shaky. Anyway, without unlocking the door, I announced that the store was closed. He told me that he just needed my help. His car had broken down in the parking lot, and he needed a boost. I didn't drive, so I told him I couldn't help him. I should have walked away there, but he was out in the rain and I did legitimately feel bad, so I told him I would see if any one of our few crew did drive. I did find someone who was willing to help, and got the night crew manager involved as well. We went out. Turns out he was parked a bit off from the entrance, in a fairly secluded spot, and he had a lady with him. There was a similar vibe with her, almost, but not exactly normal. It didn't click right away, but I figured they had been hooking up in the car in the parking lot. Maybe he left the radio or lights on and drained the battery. To me, that explained the weird, unnerving feeling. They either felt ashamed or guilty, and it was showing through. Anyway, my coworker goes over to help give them a boost. The manager and I stay out there with him, nearby, watching. The two lovebirds kept peeking over at us a bit uncomfortably. After a few moments, the coworker returns from the car and hurries us back inside. We don't see them drive off, which seems odd. We get inside, lock up again, and then the coworker thanks us for staying out there with him and not leaving him alone with them. He also caught on to the unnerving air about them, and it made him worried. What worried him more was when it also turned out that there was nothing wrong with their car. Story 13. Used to work the night shift at a middle school. Every night, while cleaning out the boys' locker room, I would hear at least one locker slam shut, sometimes more. This creeped me out when I started, but after a couple of months, I got used to it. One night, while cleaning one of the girls' locker rooms, I heard a girl scream. I walked out of the locker room, even looked outside the building, and didn't see anybody. Before that I worked at the high school, I'd randomly hear doors open and close. Nowadays I work day shift at another school. About a year ago, I just got to the building to begin my shift. It was still dark out, and I was turning on all the lights. When I walked by the main office, I heard what sounded like someone ransacking the place. Papers being tossed. I heard what sounded like a table or file cabinet being dragged. I remember my first thought was, man, somebody must have lost something important. Then I clicked. It was 6 in the morning, and it was either Thanksgiving or Christmas break, meaning there was no school, and there shouldn't be anybody in there. Took me a second to work up the courage to go in and check it out. When I did, nobody was there and nothing was out of place. Finally, last month I got a call from dispatch at 3 a.m. The fire alarm was going off and they needed somebody to go turn it off. As soon as I walk in, I freak out. The alarm is blaring, but what scared me was the strobe light that flashes with the alarm. The building was pitch black except every other second, when that strobe lit the halls up. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. I was half expecting to see someone pop up out of nowhere when the halls lit up. Story 14. Work in the winter for me is plowing and snow removal. It was late, and I had been out for over 24 hours at this point. Pulled over into a small cul-de-sac, with the nearest house being over 100 yards away, so I could let the truck stay on so I could stay warm. Six-wheel mac things loud. As I'm nodding off, there was a very loud bang, and it felt like someone pulled on my driver's side door handle. Luckily, I always lock my truck doors. I immediately threw on every strobe, rear, headlight, and started looking around, and I saw absolutely nothing. It scared me. Needless to say, I never sleep anywhere other than lit parking lots now. Story 15. Used to work nights at a Home Depot. There was one time where for a week or so our store stayed open 24 hours. For the most part, this wasn't really a problem. Typically, nobody comes shopping for home improvement items at 2 in the morning. Except that one couple that came looking for marble countertops at 1:30 in the morning, and the woman was wearing a nice dress. I guess there was also that one young lady who came looking for a toilet paper roll holder a little after midnight. I had just gotten off my first break, and she was wearing jorts and one of those white with black belt stereotypical parade outfits. She was oddly specific about which roll holder to get too. But the real story lies within the insulation. It was nearing 3 in the morning and me and another guy were stocking insulation, as well as fixing the bays and some such maintenance. A bunch of big R30s had fallen in their bay, and while I was sorting through them a hand came out of the mess and grabbed my arm. I lost my mind enough for not only the guy I was working with to freak out, but also for my boss, who was across the store, to come check out the commotion. Turns out a homeless drunkard had come into the store at some point, and I can only assume before the night crew showed up, and had made a nest in the insulation where he fell asleep. The dude was in bad shape too. Like far gone into whatever inebriation that we had to call the police to remove him. I was always a little more cautious around the insulation after that, for at least the time the store stayed open 24 hours. Story 16. I was working the Christmas Eve night shift in my local emergency department. The clock struck 4 a.m. on Christmas morning, and the emergency buzzer sounded. A 74-year-old male patient had gone into a sudden cardiac arrest. The buzzer wasn't working properly, so we couldn't locate where exactly in the department it was coming from. Once we finally figured it out, we got in there and I took over chest compressions. A team of anesthetists, nurses, doctors, and 20 minutes later, we managed to get him back just long enough for his family to come and say goodbye to him. What a Christmas! Story 17. Many years ago, I briefly had a job that started at 3:30 a.m. The job itself was very boring, but the commute was wild. The world is at its weirdest in the very early morning. Road hazards haven't been called in yet, so one day I pulled off the freeway and discovered that the off-ramp was completely flooded, deep enough that I have no idea how my car didn't stall. But the most interesting discovery was that if law enforcement has to raid a home, they do it around 3 or 4 in the morning because that's the best chance of everyone being peacefully asleep. One day I was nearly at work when I noticed something off ahead of me. I slowed down and came up to a massive police blockade, squad cars everywhere and absolutely crawling with heavily armed officers. But all in absolute silence, they silently waved me down a side street. Just a creepy, unsettling experience. Story 18. Security officer here posted one night to an old site that apparently was a hospital being turned into a rest home. With no power on site, all I had was my flashlight and laptop to watch movies, 'cause it was a 12-hour watch. Place was massive, and at night I literally can't see nothing at all. Anyways, the company had put up a temporary security camera that every time it picks up motion, the thing sends off a loud siren sound for about 30 seconds. First time that thing went off, I went to investigate with emergency service on speed dial, and goosebumps flaring, I seemed to find what was causing it to go off. It then would go off a couple more times into the night. It got to the point where I would just let it do its thing. But every time it went of it would send shivers down my spine. When we do our handover with the next guard, I would tell him all the time how the siren just goes off at night all the time. I haven't been back in a while, but man, I still think about that place till this day. It scares me. Story 19. My friend used to work at an amusement park, not a very famous one, but he worked as a security guard, sometimes taking the night shift. In this amusement park, there is this area that is themed kind of old Western style, with every building made of logs, no AC and stores, and they had a few museums showcasing all these small, extremely old items or even houses and bedding. When I say old, I mean like stuff from over 200 years old, So obviously, the original owners of said items are gone. As a night guard, he mainly just watched cameras, then checked areas out where the security alarm had been tripped. In the western area, every single night at least once, the security alarm would go off, nothing would be there, and then a while later it might go off again. Or lights would flicker when they weren't supposed to, or just completely shut off. Story 20. Worked a parking garage at the airport. Cleaning the top deck and noticed about 100 ravens all over a truck with a tarp over the bed. Took my flashlight expecting something awful. Noticed as I got closer the smell and the ravens taking turns going in a hole they had torn open and popping out covered in gunk. Some guy left a broken down beater with a couple animal carcasses in the back to rot. No heads. Checked the logs and the damn truck had been there since November, and it was April, so everything was just thawing and breaking down. That's a wrap for this video. Make sure to leave your relatable story down in the comments. I would love to make a video on them. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.